Something happened to you recently, and I'm almost certain of it. You were sitting on the couch, mindlessly watching some video on your phone, maybe a skateboarding compilation, maybe a cooking reel, and then someone on screen slammed their shin into a metal railing. And you felt it. Your leg twitched, your face scrunched up, a sharp little shiver crawled up your spine, and for half a second, your body reacted as if your shin had just been destroyed. But here's the thing, you weren't touched. Nobody hit you. You were lying on a cushion in your living room eating Doritos, and yet your nervous system fired off a pain response like you'd just been assaulted by furniture. And it doesn't stop there. Think about the last time you watched someone cry. Really cry. You know, the kind where their voice cracks and their shoulders shake, and you felt your own throat tighten up even though nothing sad was happening to you. Or that time you saw a stranger yawn across the subway car, and within 5 seconds your jaw was cracking open too, completely against your will. Or how about this? You've been around someone who talks with their hands a lot, and by the end of the conversation, you caught yourself doing it too. You didn't decide to copy them. You just did. Most people shrug this off. We call it being empathetic, or picking up vibes, or just some weird quirk of being human. And if you're someone who does this a lot, if you cry at movies, if you physically flinch during fight scenes, if you absorb other people's moods like a sponge, then maybe you've been told something very specific about yourself. You've been told you're too sensitive, too impressionable, too emotional. You need to toughen up and stop letting the world get under your skin. Your friends joke that you're a human mood ring. Your family says you take things too personally. And somewhere along the way, you started believing that this tendency, this automatic, involuntary habit of feeling what other people feel and mirroring what other people do, is a weakness, a defect, something you should learn to suppress. Here's why that diagnosis is completely biologically wrong. What if I told you that the reason you flinch when someone else gets hurt, the reason you tear up when a stranger cries, the reason you unconsciously mimic the gestures of people you're talking to, all of it, is because your brain contains a specialized neural system that was designed to do exactly that? Not a flaw, not a weakness, a feature. Buried inside your motor cortex, there are neurons that fire both when you perform an action and when you simply watch someone else perform the same action. Your brain literally rehearses other people's experiences as if they were your own. And these cells, called mirror neurons, might be one of the most important reasons that human beings became the most socially complex, culturally sophisticated species on the planet. They're also one of the most misunderstood discoveries in modern neuroscience. Some corners of the internet will tell you they're the source of telepathy or psychic connection. They're not. But the truth about what they actually do? It's arguably more impressive than any superpower. To understand how this invisible mirroring system works, and why it matters far more than you think, I want you to meet someone. His name is Mark. He's 28, works in marketing, plays guitar on weekends, and has always been the kind of person who absorbs other people's energy. He cries at commercials, he picks up accents after one conversation. He once watched a YouTube tutorial on card shuffling and could somehow do it an hour later without ever touching a deck. Mark has spent most of his life thinking this makes him a little bit soft, a little too impressionable for his own good. He's wrong, and by the end of this video, I think you'll realize that the thing you might have been embarrassed about your whole life is actually the most powerful learning tool your brain has ever built. Let me show you what's actually happening inside Mark's skull. Before we crack open Mark's brain, we need to go back to a lab in Parma, Italy in the early 1990s. And honestly, one of the most important discoveries in neuroscience happened because a graduate student got hungry. Here's the scene. A team of researchers had been studying macaque monkeys, trying to understand how the brain plans and executes movement. They'd implanted tiny needle electrodes into individual neurons in a monkey's premotor cortex. That's the region of the brain that lights up right before you move. Their goal was straightforward: record which neurons fired when the monkey reached for objects. Then came lunch break. One of the grad students walked back into the lab eating. Accounts vary on what it was: an ice cream cone, a peanut, a raisin, and the monitoring equipment went haywire. Neurons in the monkey's premotor cortex started firing, but the monkey wasn't moving. It wasn't reaching for anything. It was sitting completely still, watching a human being eat. That shouldn't have happened. The premotor cortex is supposed to be about your movements, not someone else's. It would be like your car's engine revving while you're standing on the sidewalk watching another car drive by. The hardware was responding to someone else's activity as if it were its own. The researchers, led by Giacomo Rizzolatti, didn't just stumble onto a curiosity. They had accidentally discovered an entirely new class of brain cells, neurons that mirrored observed actions. They called them, appropriately enough, mirror neurons. Now, what made these neurons fascinating wasn't just that they existed, it was how absurdly picky they were. When the researchers dug deeper, they found that mirror neurons in these monkeys were extraordinarily specific about what they'd respond to. A neuron that fired when the monkey watched someone grab a peanut with their fingers would stay completely silent if the experimenter picked up the same peanut with a pair of pliers. Same peanut, same destination, same outcome. But a different method, and that was enough for the neuron to say, "Not my problem." Mark has a buddy named Dave, you'll hear more about him later, who is infamous in their friend group for one thing. Dave only responds to emails. You can text Dave, call Dave, tag him on Slack, or send a carrier pigeon to Dave's apartment. Nothing. Radio silence, email, but format that exact same message as an email. Dave replies in 4 minutes flat. Same information, same urgency, different delivery method, and that's all it takes for Dave to decide it doesn't exist. These mirror neurons were the Dave of the nervous system, fanatically selective about the form of the action, not just the result. This raised an obvious question. Was this just a monkey thing? Some quirk of primate evolution that didn't extend to humans? Because here's the catch. The brain regions where these neurons were found in monkeys aren't identical to the equivalent regions in human brains. The architecture is different. So you couldn't just assume the same system existed in people, and you certainly couldn't use the same method to find out. Because here's a practical reality of neuroscience that nobody warns you about in school. It turns out human beings are significantly less cooperative than monkeys when it comes to letting scientists stick needle electrodes directly into their brain cells. With macaques, the researchers could record from individual neurons. With humans, you need a workaround. So scientists turned to electroencephalograms, EEGs, which are basically a net of sensors placed on the outside of your skull that detect electrical activity rippling through your brain. It's like pressing your ear against the wall of an apartment building and trying to figure out which room the party's in. You lose detail, but you gain the ability to study people without, drilling into their heads. In one key study, researchers brought in 20 volunteers and had them do two things. Watch an experimenter perform specific finger movements, pinching motions with the thumb and index finger, and then perform those same movements themselves. If mirror neurons existed in humans, the same brain regions should activate during both watching and doing. And that's exactly what happened. Parts of the motor cortex, the premotor cortex, and a region where the parietal and temporal lobes converge, an area tied to visual processing and attention, all fired up when subjects were merely watching someone else move. Their brains were silently practicing the movements they observed, even though their bodies never twitched. Mirror neurons, it turned out, were very much a human thing. Which brings us back to Mark. So now we know that buried inside your skull is a system that rehearses other people's actions as if you were performing them yourself. But what does that actually mean for your daily life? What is it doing when Mark flinches at a skateboarding video, or when he picks up a card trick from a YouTube tutorial he watched once? Let's walk through how this system manifests, because once you see these patterns, you won't be able to unsee them. 2 months ago, Mark's company hired a new creative director named Jenna. She had a very specific presentation style. She'd pause before key points, use her hands to frame ideas in the air, and drop her voice slightly when delivering the main takeaway. Mark found her captivating. He didn't study her technique. He didn't take notes on her delivery. He just watched. 3 weeks later, Mark gave a client pitch, and his coworker pulled him aside afterward. "Dude, you sounded exactly like Jenna in there. The pauses, the hand thing. When did you start doing that?" Mark had no idea he'd adopted any of it. This is the mirror neuron system's primary job, and it might be the single most underrated ability in the human brain: learning through observation. A study from 2009 demonstrated this beautifully. Researchers set up an experiment using a game similar to Dance Dance Revolution and tested 2 groups of people learning new dance sequences. One group learned from symbols on a screen, arrows and visual cues telling them which steps to perform. The other group got the same symbols, but also watched an actual human being demonstrate the choreography. The results were striking. The group that watched a human model performed significantly better on the final test, and when researchers scanned their brains, the regions associated with mirror neurons, particularly the superior temporal cortex, were far more active in the human model group. Their mirror systems had been silently rehearsing every movement the dancer performed, building motor plans in the background without the participants even realizing it. This is why Mark can watch a card trick on YouTube and replicate it without hours of deliberate practice. His brain wasn't passively consuming the video. It was performing the trick internally, running a simulation at the neuronal level, so that when his hands finally picked up the deck, the motor plan was already half built. And this is not a small thing. Think about what this means for the entire arc of human civilization. Before written language, before schools, before textbooks, the primary way knowledge moved from one generation to the next was a child watching an adult do something and absorbing it. Making tools, building fire, weaving baskets. Every skill that kept early humans alive was transmitted through the mirror system. You are, right now, benefiting from a learning engine that your ancestors used to survive the savannah. And you activate it every time you watch someone do something, whether it's a TED Talk or a TikTok. But Mark's mirror system doesn't just help him learn. It does something stranger, something he finds genuinely unsettling if he thinks about it too hard. Mark is a social chameleon, and he can't turn it off. When he's around his southern uncle for Thanksgiving, he leaves with a drawl. When he spends a weekend with his college buddy from Boston, he starts dropping R's. And remember Dave, the email-only guy? After a 3-hour dinner with Dave last month, Mark caught himself checking his inbox compulsively for 2 days straight, a habit he'd never had before. When his girlfriend talks with her hands during arguments, he catches himself doing it back. Mark used to think this meant he had no personality of his own, that he was just a blank slate absorbing whoever was nearest. He was half right. He is absorbing, but not because he lacks identity, because his mirror system is doing what it was designed to do, synchronizing his behavior with the people around him. There's a fascinating wrinkle here. Human mirror neurons operate differently from the ones found in monkeys, and the difference reveals something profound about our species. In macaques, mirror neurons are tightly tied to the meaning of an action. If a monkey watches someone grab a bottle in a normal, functional way, the mirror neurons respond. But if someone grabs the same bottle with an awkward, upside-down grip that doesn't serve any obvious purpose, the mirror neurons go quiet. It's as if the monkey's brain is asking, does this action make sense? And if the answer is no, it stops paying attention. Human mirror neurons don't do that. In human brains, the frontal lobe's mirror regions fire regardless of whether the observed action is meaningful or meaningless. Your brain mirrors a purposeful handshake and a weird, pointless hand flapping with equal enthusiasm. It doesn't filter for logic. It mirrors everything. And this might be the single most important neurological difference between humans and other primates, because it means our brains are built to catalog movements that currently have no obvious purpose, just in case they turn out to be useful later. We're not just learning the things that make sense. We're learning the things that might make sense someday. Our brains are hoarding motor patterns like a prepper hoarding canned goods, and that compulsive, undiscriminating tendency to mirror everything we see is probably a big part of why we're the species that invented sign language, ballet, surgery, and the slam dunk. We watch, we absorb, we don't ask why until later. Now we arrive at the question everyone actually wants answered, the one that launched 1,000 breathless headlines and at least 3 pseudoscientific documentaries. If the big one, do mirror neurons give us empathy? Mark would be a good case study because Mark is an empathy machine. He cries during that commercial with the dog waiting for the soldier to come home. He can walk into a room and immediately sense tension between 2 people who haven't said a word. When his friend got dumped last year, Mark's chest physically hurt as if he'd been the one broken up with. The idea that mirror neurons underlie empathy is intoxicating, and the logic is seductive. If your brain simulates another person's actions when you watch them, isn't it plausible that it also simulates their emotions when you observe their facial expressions? That you literally feel a faint version of someone else's sadness because your brain is running a low-resolution copy of their emotional state? Some research supports this. Science. One study presented 18 people with social scenarios, a son bringing home a failing report card, a father who hadn't seen it yet, and asked them to identify what each character was feeling, then to predict what they'd feel if circumstances changed. One of the brain's mirror regions, the inferior parietal lobule, activated during these empathy tasks, and the more active it was, the higher participants scored on standardized empathy tests. If this data holds up, it suggests that when Mark watches his friend cry, his brain isn't just recognizing sadness from a distance. It's running a miniature simulation of that sadness internally, and the strength of that simulation correlates with how empathetic Mark actually is. But, and this is the kind of but that keeps neuroscientists awake at night, a lot of other studies don't find this link. And here's where intellectual honesty matters more than a good story. Many of the studies exploring mirror neurons and empathy have small sample sizes, 18 people, 20 people, which means they lack the statistical power to reliably detect subtle effects. Some studies find the connection, others don't. And all of them are correlational, which means they can tell you that 2 things happen at the same time, but they can't tell you that one causes the other. It's the difference between saying people who carry umbrellas tend to be near rain, and umbrellas cause rain. We know that mirror regions light up when people empathize. We do not yet know whether those regions are necessary for empathy, or whether they're just along for the ride. A neurological bystander that happens to be in the neighborhood when the emotional processing is going down. So where does that leave us? Honestly, in one of the most interesting places in neuroscience, the middle. We have suggestive evidence, we have a compelling theory, and we have enough contradictory data to keep the argument alive for another decade. If you're the kind of person who needs a clean, definitive answer, mirror neurons are the source of empathy, period. I can't give you that. Nobody can. Not yet. What I can tell you is that the question itself is one of the most actively researched problems in the field, and the answer, when it comes, will reshape our understanding of what it means to be a social animal. Let's zoom out from Mark's skull for a moment and look at the full picture. Whether or not mirror neurons turn out to be the engine of empathy, what we already know they do is extraordinary enough. You have a neural system that turns passive observation into active motor rehearsal. Every time you watch someone do something, a chef julienning a carrot, a guitarist sliding between chords, a stranger parallel parking with suspicious ease, your brain is silently building a motor program for that action. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to give you a massive head start if you ever try it yourself. Now multiply that by every human being who's ever lived. This is how culture works. Not just through language, not just through books, through brains that are wired to absorb skills, gestures, expressions, and behaviors just by being in proximity to other humans. A child doesn't learn to use a fork because someone gives them a lecture on utensil mechanics. They learn because they watched their parent do it 1,000 times, and their mirror system quietly encoded the motor plan long before their conscious mind got involved. The passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, toolmaking, cooking, hunting, building, dancing, fighting, healing, all of it rode on the back of the mirror neuron system for hundreds of thousands of years before anyone thought to write things down. You could make a reasonable argument that these neurons are one of the foundational pillars of human civilization. Not the only one, but one of the load-bearing walls. And that brings me back to Mark. And to you. If you're someone who absorbs other people's energy, who mimics without meaning to, who flinches at someone else's pain and tears up at someone else's joy, you are not too sensitive. You are not defective. You are not lacking some thick skin that tougher people seem to have. You are running one of the most sophisticated neurological systems in the known universe at high capacity. The thing you've been told is a weakness? It's the same system that allowed humans to build pyramids by watching each other stack stones. It's the system that lets a child in Oklahoma learn to play piano by studying a masterclass filmed in Vienna. It's the engine that turns, "I saw someone do this once," into "I can do this too." Mark doesn't need to toughen up. Mark's brain is doing exactly what 300,000 years of evolution built it to do, absorbing, mirroring, rehearsing, learning. The volume might be turned up a little higher than average, but the signal is the same one that makes all of us human. I want to close with something that might seem unusual for a science video, an admission of what we don't know. Mirror neurons were discovered about 30 years ago, and in that time, they've been credited with everything from the origin of language to the explanation of autism to the secret behind telepathy. Most of those claims were wildly premature. The truth is more modest and far more interesting. We know mirror neurons exist in monkeys, and that analogous systems exist in humans. We know they help us learn through observation. We know they fire during action and during observation of action. We have tantalizing but inconclusive evidence that they play a role in empathy. And we have enormous, unopened questions about their involvement in social bonding, language acquisition, and the broader machinery of human culture. In neuroscience, not knowing isn't a failure. It's an invitation. Every unanswered question about mirror neurons is a door that some researcher, somewhere, is trying to kick open right now. And the answers, when they arrive, won't just tell us how the brain works. They'll tell us why we're the kind of species that cries at movies, learns from strangers, and builds entire civilizations on the back of watching each other. So the next time you catch yourself flinching at someone else's pain, or picking up a friend's mannerisms, or tearing up during a scene that has nothing to do with your life, don't fight it. Don't be embarrassed by it. Recognize it for what it is, your brain doing the thing it was built to do. That's the thing that, across thousands of generations, helped turn a scattered species of primates into the most collaborative, most imitative, most culturally rich creatures this planet has ever produced. Your mirror neurons aren't making you weak, they're making you human. And if this shifted how you think about your own brain, even a little, share it with someone who needs to hear it. especially the person in your life who's always been told they feel too much, because science says they're doing it exactly right. I'll see you in the next one, where we keep pulling apart the machinery behind everything you think you know about your own mind.